And we are back from that development in South Africa. And back here, it is a totally different story because many people have been complaining the cost of gas is already up, cost of loans is up. I think there was also the issue, or even actually digital lending, all this mobile M-Pesa and all the different things. There's just a problem in the country, as it were. People are feeling the pinch, as we like to say. Jamila is going to set for us the scene. Are you feeling it?
Yes, yes, most definitely. And we were talking about how we're starting to receive messages from the mobile phone company, from your bank, from the SACCO, from trying to remember the other one, from even in your internet provider, telling you that inapanda. That's
it's almost like they start someone and say, Tuma sasa.
And the pinch is being felt, and Kenyans are saying why. But we all know that the finance bill is one of the ways that the government is trying to get some money, considering the fact that its revenue does not match its expenditure, because overspending, wastage, resources, corruption. So the main way, or the one of the ways that they feel that they can raise money is by taxing poor Wanjiku, instead of maybe finding ways to reduce their expenditure. And I don't understand how, because I think Kenya Revenue Authority, I think they surpassed their targets. They raised about...
No, they haven't.
No, the monthly one.
But overall,
I think until April they had. I think they had gone above their targets for about 5 months until the month of April. I've not looked at the latest numbers, but basically the thing is the government is trying to raise money, considering the fact that it's overspending. And I was looking at why can't it look at other ways to try and reduce costs. I was reading somewhere that I think the Ethiopian government has decided that it's going to cut the number of embassies it has in other countries as a way to try and manage costs. I think even in Kenya, the ambassador atarudi kwao, kuja mara moja, just as a measure of trying to reduce government spending in a way to try and help the country. And I think for us as a country, we need to find a way to cut our expenditure. Someone was telling me, why would you increase the price of gas when you have senior government officials driving fuel guzzlers? Why can't you find other ways? We've had the president talking about this in different forums, austerity measures, but inafikaga wapi. So I think what Kenyans are experiencing now is biting, and it's just the beginning. And it's the fact that utaenda, utapata bei ya kitu fulani imepanda, and there's nothing you can do about it, because if you need those commodities, you have to find a way to pay for them. But where is the money? Where mwenyewe unatoa wapi hela za kulipia hiyo? We keep talking about how the pandemic has affected people in their daily lives. Kazi zimepotea, biashara imeathirika, people are still working under pay cuts. You still have children to feed, you still have school fees to pay, you still have to pay for your rent. But then now there's this extra added, something that you had not budgeted for or even had in the horizon that you have to deal with now. So this is the time when utaanza kuambia watu kaza mkanda, but it's really painful. Unajaribu kaza mkanda, but it's painful.
Joe, put it this way. Every time we see the budget making process commence, and unlike previous dispensations, it's a year-long thing. When we hear Parliament talk about preparing for a budget from the executive and the National Treasury particularly, and you hear a 3 trillion shillings budget, it should first ring a bell. And the first bell that should ring to all of us is, how will the budget be financed? If you're able to answer that question, then some of these proposals, some of these measures, then should not surprise us when they come. Because if you have a 3 trillion shillings budget, and the last financial year, Kenya Revenue Authority collected well above 1.6 trillion shillings or thereabouts, and you're talking about a 3 trillion shillings budget, then it tells you that you have a budget that is bigger than the revenue that is being generated. So how will this budget be financed? By borrowing or by extra taxation?
It's like in your house, like you say, this month I'm going to spend 150,000.
And you earn
50,000
maybe
or 70,000
or whatever. So you have to ask, it's fine, you will spend it, but where is it going to come from? Because we know your pay doesn't get there.
Precisely. And then secondly, it is also important that we understand how the government spends its money. The first charge is on debt. Inakati wangu kwa
at source.
At source.
The way our taxes are cut at source,
it is deducted at source. So there is a relationship between the loans that were borrowed previously and the current situation that we find ourselves in. And number three, the cost of borrowing those loans. Yeah? Some of them were commercial loans at very high interest rates, as opposed to long-term, less interest loans. So some of the challenges that we face. So sometimes when we do stories and we have figures, Kenya has a debt burden of 9 trillion, 10 trillion, many people probably don't understand what it means. But more importantly, it's not wrong to borrow. The government will not be able to sustain all of us without some sort of borrowing. But the question is, what do you borrow for and at what cost? If these loans are cost effective and there is a proper return on investments, then it becomes easy to see the benefits and the dividends of these loans. But as long as we are servicing expensive loans, as long as we're talking about corruption, because high taxation and corruption are cousins. What do I mean? Some of this money that was borrowed at high interest rates, some of it went into some people's pockets, as opposed to projects that would have essentially helped to revamp the economy and create an enabling environment for people to do business and to create employment and so on and so forth. So some of these taxes that we are paying are being used to pay loans that were borrowed at high interest rates and ended up in the pockets of a few. That is the connection.
And Linus, you know, there are all these big terminologies that people are using, budget deficit, cost of borrowing, all of these things. But at the end, on the ground, people are feeling the heat. It is in the middle of a pandemic, and even those reliefs that had been given a little bit earlier, they are no longer there yet. Banks, SACCOs, all of these people who had put kind of a moratorium on the repayment, they have since recalled us saying, hey, you know, no, you have to pay us. Things have to move on. So on the ground, people are not hearing all these big terminologies that economists are using, but they're dealing with a daily reality, coming face to face with a very difficult reality that now they have.
Yes, Joe, because in my view, budgets in the last few years have not been really about the people. The budgets have been about allowing us to get along and get through a very difficult situation, brought about by the fact that everything points out at the fact that we are living beyond our means, which is why taxation. And every time I look at the taxation measures, including this year, you read despair in these taxation measures. Remember the other day, the proposal to tax baby formula. This is the closest we have ever come as a country to taxing breast milk. It's very, very close. You know, it's just one step away from that, basically. And that tells us we are very desperate, because we have loans to repay. We have a very large, and this is the question that you know, has never been addressed, and that's the question of cutting our costs, basically. The size of our government, the bureaucracy, you know, it takes money to run it. And our budget measures have never really been about those cost-cutting measures. Now, the burden has been pushed to even the informal sector. Because when you talk of gas prices going up, cooking gas prices going up, what it means, you know, these MECOs that we have that gave the people in the lower end of our chain a chance at, you know, cooking a meal the same way the rest of the urban people do. What it does is it takes them a step down again. What will we see? You drive through Kibera, drive through construction sites, and you'll see a lot of Kenyans collecting firewood in urban centers. You know, those trees that have been felled by construction equipment. People are collecting that because now they'll have to rely on firewood, again, in urban centers as a source of energy, which is very, very sad, because then it means we will have a sector of our economy that never really comes out of the doldrums. Those who have will continue to have, and those who don't will stay in the same place for a long while. I'm hoping for a day we'll have a budget that actually, and we hear politicians talking of bottom-up, and they can't quite qualify bottom-up, because if this is the kind of budget that then is presented by the very government they serve, then we don't know what bottom-up ought to look like.
And Yvonne, just before you're coming, I mean, I hear you about cooking gas and all of these things, and for me, as a student of environmental questions, I think there is such an interesting contradiction.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, there are many commitments we've made, by the way, with regard to climate change, for example. There are international commitments that we make. We make domestic commitments to meet those international obligations that we have. And then you would expect that any government policy, any action by the different ministries and everything would actually conform to the commitments that we have made. So there's no way that you can be saying that you are dealing with, for example, climate change, or in fact even just health issues, because those people are going to use firewood, as Linus was saying, or kerosene, which in itself has very many health-related respiratory issues and those kinds of things. So it is really working at cross purposes, where you are on the one hand saying this is the direction we are going, and what you're doing is really undoing whatever gains are there. And it's how, you know, what you say is completely different from what you do. And that for me, I find a bit confusing. And there are very many other measures in that illustrate that very point. And Yvonne, you've been following this very, very closely. What is this?
Counterintuitive, actually, was, I just wanted to back up what you said with a few statistics. So in 2019, the Kenya government actually started a campaign and a push towards moving people from using charcoal and firewood to using gas. In fact, at the time, they said in 2019, I think there's about less than 5% of households using LPG, and they wanted to move that number up to 42. And at the time, when you talk about the respiratory diseases, they had, according to their research, said that 21,000 Kenyans die each year from respiratory illnesses due to inhalation of smoke from charcoal stoves and firewood as well. You know, I think that even started this campaign to give out the small, is it 6-liter gas cylinders?
6 kg.
To as many households as possible. And then you have, you know, this tax that is imposed. But then, of course, there are a couple of other things. So when you talk about mobile phone airtime and data, you know, at a time when, if you recall, at the start of this administration in 2013, is tumetoka analog to naenda
digital.
Yeah. And now we are charging a lot more for digital in a pandemic when people are staying home. And then there is a 20% excise duty on all bank charges. That means loans, everything, you know, interest goes up. Let me give you an example, for instance. The digital loans, which are heavily affected by this, are so important for people who run small businesses. We know, and on my business show, Dr. Bitangi Ndemo was saying that there's mamambogas who borrow digital loans, because you know they're discreet, you can do it even right now. So they borrow at a time like this, get money for stock. At 4 in the morning, they're at Marikiti, they're, you know, purchasing their supplies. By around noon or 3 in the afternoon, they have sold, made their money back and repaid the loans. But now the cost of those loans are going up, and it's going to have a ripple effect. So for instance, now if you were to take a loan on Fuliza for 1,000 shillings, you would pay 25 shillings in tax. In tax alone. So we haven't even charged the interest itself. So if you run an eatery and you're borrowing this money to buy stocks and supplies, and the cost of that borrowing has gone up, you're going to pass that charge on to your customers, as the banks are doing to the rest of us. Those customers, remember, already we've got 1.2 million people who've lost their jobs. We've got livelihoods depressed, you know, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of these things, you know, just don't make sense. But the reason is we're truly in a hole. We are truly deeply in a hole. KRA has not been meeting its targets, not just for months, but for years. But also when you take a look at it, and I keep saying, you know, we talk about the executive and its borrowing. Please let's remember that the Public Finance Management Act gives Parliament a greater say and a greater role in borrowing. They cap limits, They set ceilings. We've seen the, you cover Parliament, so you know, they, raise the ceiling from what to now? Twice.
And it's a rule
we're almost heading to 15 now.
Yeah, we're almost heading to 15. They have the power now to deal with the deficit. This is not just about the executive and the National Treasury, right? So they can increase any allocation in a budget. Literally say, remove here, add here. Why are we spending more on this? Let's remove here. Let's change these taxes. All of these things were voted in by your members of Parliament. The Finance Act is not well, it may have started in the Treasury and it comes into Parliament, but it's Parliament that votes on all of these matters. And yes, they may have removed the tax on bread, but then look at everything else that's going to be expensive that will drive up the cost of living and food in many other areas.
Put it this way, Yvonne, I see you're trying to be nice, but put it the way it should be put. When you see our parliamentarians complain on Twitter, on social media, like all of us, like any other person, then it's a problem. Yeah. Why? Because this extra taxation, this rise in taxation is not accidental. It is legal. Legal because a law was passed. Which law? The Finance Bill of 2021. Yep. Our parliamentarians, if they were available that day to pass the BBI bill, 235 of them, they would also have been available on that particular day when the bill was being voted for to raise questions and even move amendments, because this is an act of Parliament. They could have proposed amendments at the committee stage and said, don't do this, don't do this. Add here, remove here. The reason why, unfortunately, this law has passed and a good number of them are complaining on social media is because they were not in Parliament. They weren't, which is a clear case of absconding their duties as parliamentarians. So when you see a member of Parliament complaining, so when you see parliamentarians complain about the taxes, then the question you should ask them is, where were you when this law was passed? But
also, it is important to note that historically, from 2013 to this point, continuing to allow the executive to borrow as much as they have, because truly, deeply, we, unless you do some drastic cuts, we'll have to keep borrowing more, as we have done with IMF, which hopefully might be a shot in the arm, because you're borrowing all of this money, which rates are better than all of these other commercial debts that we have taken that are far more expensive. But that, this is a series of years and years of bad decisions, bad legislation, lack of accountability and oversight of the executive that has brought us to this point. And that is fairly sad. In a COVID pandemic, when things are especially hard for a lot of people, all of those tax relief measures that were there to cushion us last year are not there.
Hope one day, and very soon, we will have the uncomfortable discussion as a country, right from the government, on the cost of running the country. What is the cost of running a government? Because you will see a lot of duplication, you will see a lot of wastage, you will see a lot of pilferage. If we were to have that discussion, then you would see some of the areas where the taxes that are collected from many Kenyans who are complaining end up. When the former Auditor General was exiting, he told us a third of the budget, Edward Ouko, a third of the budget cannot be accounted for. He didn't say is stolen, but cannot be accounted for, which is a very, very close relative of has been stolen. Because if it cannot be accounted for, then it means there's a problem. If we were to be frugal, if we were to be diligent, if we were to be prudent in management of these resources that are gotten through taxation and through borrowing, then the economy would be spurred, and then it would be easier for people to have more and more income in their pockets, such that even if you tax them a little more, they're making a little more. I mean, look at what happens in other countries. Their taxation percentages are higher than ours. But why is it that they are a little more comfortable than us? Because basic commodities are availed by the government or at a cost that is easy to meet.
Yeah, and the last word on this is that whenever the